when I chew my food.
Yeah, I think we're.
Having
so that the light turns green, red then green. Need both their hands. Yeah. I don't think you. No, you don't get any more length on that. Yeah. Unfortunately. So. There we go. All right.
A couple minutes. I got 12:05. You might want to move up and sit up closer. The post gets kind of annoying. So there's plenty of seats up front. Front row is not reserved. You're welcome to sit in the front row. Sit right there, Greg. You'll be very comfortable. Oh, well, grab the two front row seats. That way you can't look at your BlackBerry. You'll have to actually. I think we're good. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we have reached critical mass, and it's time for us to get this show on the road. My name's Peter Scosi. I'm Executive Vice President here at Metropolitan Planning Council, so welcome to our roundtable. Tough stuff, resilient infrastructure in a changing world. Metropolitan Planning Council puts on these roundtables, these lunchtime policy discussions, as they are part of our work plan. These discussions help to advance some of the policy issues that we're working on here internally, sometimes leading into a new initiative, sometimes helping us form something that's midway, sometimes helping us announce something that's recently been completed. But we appreciate your participation here today because you are helping us in doing that work and in that work plan. We're going to hear from a few speakers today on the topic, and then we're going to have ample time at the end of the program for questions and answers. And so I encourage you to think about your questions and answers while folks are presenting. We'll come around with a microphone at the end, and that's also a really critical component of these events. We definitely want to have that audience engagement. I want to thank our sponsor for today's event, first and foremost, ComEd. This was something that our board member, Tyler Anthony, a topic that we were discussing again during our work planning process, and was sort of mutual convergence, mutual evolution, and to bringing this to you today. ComEd certainly has an interest in resilient infrastructure, and you'll learn a little bit about our interests in that topic as well. So thanks to Tyler for that. Today's event is being recorded by WBZ for Chicago Amplified. So this will be available later for podcast. And again, when the questions and answer period begins, we ask that you wait for the microphone, identify yourself before you speak so that we can get a full recording. So on to today's topic, resilient infrastructure in a changing world. Hurricane Sandy certainly brought the issue of resiliency and infrastructure to our forefront, to the forefront of the minds of planners across the country. A lot of discussions about how to better prepare for hurricanes and other natural disasters and significant acts. But those aren't really the only challenges that face cities moving forward. Certainly in Chicago, I don't think we have to fear from a hurricane. But we do have to fear from perhaps heat waves, such as those that we saw in 1995 and even since then, and the impacts that those have on our climate, on our populace and communities. We may have to worry about severe rains, such as those that we had a few weeks ago, and the flooding that those create. And sometimes it's not just natural disasters that affect our region as well. The financial crisis of late affected our region significantly, led to a large number of single-family homeowners in the suburbs needing to rent their homes for the short term or maybe long term, which was a new phenomenon for many suburban communities that were theretofore unprepared for a rental environment such as that. So some of these conditions could be man-made as well. Resiliency is really about how a region and a city not only responds to those crises and continues to operate through them, but also bounces back after that they occur. So there's a lot of parallels you'll hear, and the literature talks a lot about it, the parallels to sustainability, but maybe it goes a little bit beyond that. I think our speakers will get into some of those issues today. For us, this is still a relatively new term, a relatively new phenomenon, and something that we're trying to grapple with ourselves. However, if we look back over our work plan over the past couple years, there seems to be a great connection between good planning and resiliency. So for example, our work with the green infrastructure grants in the Logan Square neighborhood, where we're helping to incent and bring about green infrastructure as a way to manage stormwater, is itself a redundant system to the gray infrastructure that helps support flooding and those storms that I mentioned already. So you see, resiliency has sort of naturally inherent contradictions or conflicts, if you will. It's both soft and hard. It's both smart and dumb. It's both, again, sort of natural and man-made. So, for example, again, the bus rapid transit work that Metropolitan Planning Council has been working on, buses themselves could be seen as a more resilient form of transportation. The fact that a bus isn't derailed when a train falls off the tracks, but that it could go around an obstacle, provides for a more resilient and flexible service. Those are some of the attributes or some of the elements of resiliency. Furthermore, we've been working within the soft side and the sort of human component of resiliency. You have to have plans in place for dealing with these issues. Our work around organizing and helping to organize communities around the Fox River Valley and the Northwest Water Planning Alliance puts together a system for responding to floods, responding to droughts, and other water needs. So that becomes a sort of softer side of resiliency planning. So we wouldn't, be honest with you, right? We didn't set up our work plan and say, we're going to be a resilient group now, and we're going to do everything that's resilient. No, we just set about doing what we identified as good planning, and there seems to be a lot of overlaps between the two. So this is an exciting area, again, for us to continue to explore. We're happy to be joined by three terrific speakers today that'll help us explore this topic further. We're going to take them in order of your agenda. So first we're going to hear from Sybil. Sybil is the Director of Sustainable Urban Networks Lab at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research there concentrates on sustainable, resilient urban infrastructure, and a lot of the studies that he's working on help us to learn more about sustainability and resiliency, and he's going to bring us up to speed on that. Tyler Anthony, in addition to being a board member at MPC, is the manages distribution operations for ComEd's entire service area. That's about 70% of the state's population, if you will. And he also worked as the vice president of outage planning while at ComEd. So I suspect there's some good overlaps between planning for outages and dealing with a resilient electrical grid. Stefan Konya is the chief of staff for the Illinois Department of Public Health. I was joking with him earlier. If you read his bio, he's the chief of staff, he's the chief operating officer, the chief results officer. So we have three jobs in one, and we are definitely doing all we can to save the state money by giving him as many hats as possible. We'll talk about the BRACE project. BRACE is building, lost my notes. BRACE is building resiliency against climate effects, also a joint partnership with the University of Illinois at Chicago. So we're going to take our speakers up one by one. I'm going to turn it over to Sybil in just a moment. Come on up, Sybil. And again, keep your questions in your head. If you need to jot them down or something, we'll be back at the end of the program to cover those. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming here. I'm definitely very, very happy to be here. So as the academic here, I'm really going to try to stay away from the applied stuff and stay on the conceptual and theoretical stuff as much as I can. So I hope you enjoy that. The first slide that I have here, that's a picture of Rome at night. And I really like that picture because when we look at it, it could be something that you could see through a microscope, like a living organism. And I like that because Rome is nearly 3,000 years old and has been planned and planned and planned. And despite that, there are some processes here that happen and we don't really know why and how. These are what some may call self-organizing principle or processes. And I really like that because despite the planning, we still have those processes that happen and that we don't understand now. And I'm a true believer in planning and I really want to emphasize the planning, but I think planning can only come in a good way if we understand those processes to start with. It's funny, when I was preparing my slides, and yesterday I just saw that the Rockefeller Foundation actually announced $100 million to fund chief resilience officers in 100 cities in the world. So I think resilience is definitely a timely topic, and I'm really glad to see that. Now I think what really comes out of that is that we're really now going beyond sustainability. It's not just about making things so that we lower our emissions. It's about really thinking in terms of sustainability in its broader concept, as in sustaining over time, so that whatever happens, we can still sustain and be sustainable. So it's now we're really going beyond that traditional sense of sustainability. Now, urban resilience is a fairly vague, I want to say, concept. We all know what it is, and then we ask someone else what they think it is, and they're in a different field, and they really give us an approach that we completely forgot or didn't think about. So I like to start often when we have those new topics, I like to start with a few keywords. And here, really my work is mostly on infrastructure, so I like to focus a little bit on the infrastructure, not so much on the social aspect. And of course, when we think about resilient infrastructure, we think about smart infrastructure, so that's part of it. So that smart cities thing is really something that we're going towards now. There's robustness as well. Perturbation is something that we hear all the time. Resiliency is the ability to recover from perturbations. There's sustainability, and again, what I've just told you. And I think sustainability really comes in, and I think, in my personal view, sustainability includes resilience, but it's everything together. There's scalability. Now, that's something you may know or may not know, but cities are all scalable. And whether you look at a city of 50,000 people or a city of 5 million people, they have common characteristics. And everywhere you go in the world. And not only that, but these characteristics used to be remain at the nation level. So, scalability in the US, scalability in France, scalability in Germany, scalability in Japan. But now with globalization, all cities are starting to see the same patterns. And we can actually really see the obvious scalable cities from a small one to a bigger one. There's also networks. Now, networks is a big part of my work. And you might hear a bit more about distributed networks in terms of resilience. And that comes back to the point I have right on that, centralization versus decentralization. If something is centralized and we cut it, then we're all in a big mess. Whereas if it's decentralized, like the internet, for instance, we commonly say that you can shut off 80% of the internet and it's still going to be running. Then we also have those planning versus self-organizing principles. And I'm really, really hard on that. I'm really trying to understand the self-organizing principles so that we can then steer them, control them, steer them in a way that we're more resilient and more sustainable in the future. And then there's others there that you might know, that you might not know. Just show of hands, who has heard of complex systems? Quite a few. Complex systems is really the heart of what I'm doing. Cities are complex systems, and unfortunately I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it's right here. There's also cascade and percolation theory. So the definition, when we think about resilience, I want to say the definition of what to what. I mean, the first definition of resilience was for an ecosystem. Here I have the resilience of a specific ecological organization is measured by the amount of change that a system can experience before it is forced to reorganize. So here we really have those words, change. So how much change can we actually endure before we have to reorganize? Now there's more the physics approach of the ability to resist disorder. And if any of you here knows anything about physics, if you see disorder, you think about entropy. So how do we minimize entropy? And then there's the capacity to recover from non-structural changes. So we have some changes, and how do we recover from them? And I think there's also that time aspect. How long does it take to recover? Is it going to take 1 day? Is it going to take 1 week? Is it going to take 1 year? And again, from what? From social, from economic, from environmental stresses. So we're going to hear a lot about environmental stresses with Superstorm Sandy, but we also obviously have the economic stresses with the crisis that's been going on for the past 5 years. And I want to say we even have social stresses. Some of them have been going on for centuries, like urbanization. We keep urbanizing. So this is a change, and we need to be resilient, and we need to adapt. There's really all scales and all time length. Now, the thing here that I want to emphasize is, for instance, those three systems and how they react to, or how resilient they are. And the first one right there on the left is the resistant system. That means that if you have some little change, it's going to come back very fast to its equilibrium, but if you have a big change, it's going to collapse. And so that's why it's very resistant, and that's typically, I want to say, what planning is about. Trying to exactly have what we want, and then if we change a little bit, sometimes we can collapse. Now in the middle, we have a more resilient system. Even though it might take a little bit longer to come back to its equilibrium, it is more resilient because you can have bigger changes. And I think that's when we come back to those self-organizing principles. Cities are self-organizing because we have people, and people, we have certain decisions. So if we can account for them and make our planning accordingly, then we can be a lot more resilient. And then here on the right, I have a system with multiple equilibrium. I personally, I don't really like that picture because I don't think equilibrium exists. I'm sure a lot of you agree. We're in perpetual disequilibrium. We're trying to reach that equilibrium, but it only lasts for one instant. So every day we have to reach a new equilibrium. Now, planning for resilience. A lot of people are trying to plan for resilience at the moment. And is it the state of practice? I'm not sure, but sometimes you're going to hear, or most of the time you're going to hear about efficiency. You're going to hear about economies of scale. You're going to hear about optimization. So how do I do something? How do I make it the most efficient with the least cost? And when you do that for a network, what you're going to get is a tree network. It's exactly like a tree where you have your trunk, then splits into branches, and then splits again and splits again. But of course, we know now when we think about resilience that if you cut something, then, if you cut the tree, then it's not going to grow. But the tree still has a lot to teach us. Really, really a lot. And the fact is that the most resilient part of a tree is actually the leaf. Because even though the leaf, right there, look at the top, even though it has sort of a tree structure, if you cut or if you puncture the trunk, there, a little trunk, I would say, you still have the nutrients that spread throughout the leaf. So that's a lot more resilient. But, and again, that's a big but, I'm going to have my friend in optimization saying, well, all right, you're right, we should have some alternatives and make sure that we don't get to one place by only one route, but we have two or three. But I'm saying, but the thing is, we just can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And I didn't say that, it's Einstein, and I really like that. So we might have another constraint to try to account for that resilience, but if we're still using the same mindset, we're not going to solve anything. We just might be delaying a problem. So I'm really, really adamant about that. So what are the solutions? I would think that to start with, we need to better understand cities. And there I really come back to the self-organizing principles. Cities are complex systems. What does that mean? Is anything happening? Then there's a big field now emerging called urban science. And it's really looking at cities as science. And that came about from physicists who I guess didn't want to look at the sky anymore, and they started looking at cities and looking at laws and patterns in cities. And it's incredible how cities are alike. Even though they all emerged from different needs, from different histories, they are alike. So there's that science that's emerging, and by understanding the science or these cities, we'll be able to make them more resilient. The other thing is a better integration of urban systems. And that's really something that's close to me. That's really close to my research. Even at UIC now, I created a new course called Cities and Sustainable Infrastructure. And the main design project there is to have a completely empty plot of land right here in Chicago. And I told my students, just develop it. So you put the buildings, you put the transportation, you put the water, you put the electricity, you put everything. So that you don't silo it into just one system, but you have to think about everything all together. And they really came up with great ideas. And I think it's by trying to make them a little bit more creative that we're actually going to start seeing some changes. One of them, for instance, is, so now if you ask any of the students in my class, how many tons of CO2 per capita does the average Chicagoan emit? They're going to tell you 12 tons. I say, well, that's good. And what about the average water consumption? 100 gallons. And what about the average electricity consumption? 11.28 megawatt hours. It's not about, these things are all different, and these things are not easy to understand. What is megawatt hour? These things are clearly not easy to understand, but it's really by trying to get to become more familiar with all of the systems together, that we can then try to integrate them together and to be more resilient. So I think that after that, we're really going to come with a definition or a redefinition of planning for urban resilience, because planning is the key. Those self-organization principles are not going to take us really, really far. So really, planning is the key. And then there's scenario analysis. Now, one thing I just want to show you now is that's my work I did on subway networks in the world. So they have 32 subway networks in the world here. And I worked with them, and after a while, decided just to visualize them differently. So all of these circles are different networks. And all of the points are stations, and all of the little links are just rails between two stations. And I really like that because just here, I want to ask you, where's Chicago? I think more importantly, where would you like Chicago to be? So if I just show you here, now we have Chicago. It's just bottom row here on the left. And so it's relatively sparse compared to others, or dense compared to others. And there's really a lot we can learn just by looking at the things that we've been looking at for the past 50 years in a bit differently. And in fact, I got so enthused by that I made a little poster here where, with a little nicer diagrams and some metrics. And I actually have a copy here that I'm giving to MPC, so if you want to come and have a look after, you're welcome to, and try to see what you see in those diagrams and what you can come up out of it. And then the last thing is that scenario analysis, and that's really something I'm getting into now, is again, instead of trying to play with a few metrics to get the optimized, we just play with all of the metrics and we see what comes out. So you have a simple model, whatever it is, and then you change, let's say population is going to change by 10%, by 50%, by 100%, and you just do that for all of your variables, and you get a bunch of scenarios, and then you just plot those scenarios, plotting what is another issue, but then you can really see, by going through the scenarios, what you want to avoid and what to do in which case. If that happens, what do I have to do to recover? But this is not easy. That scenario analysis is clearly not easy, especially when models at the moment, computing power is getting better, but when we have a big model like the one in Chicago, that might take a week just to run one scenario. So if you want to do 100 of them, it's not easy. And then we have future cities. We can talk about that, what we would like to have in future cities. I really want to leave you with that slide now, which I really like. So it's not from my course. It's a similar course where I was a teaching assistant when I did my PhD. And one of the students, a 22-year-old student, that's not a child, actually decided to draw a sustainable city. And what I like about that is whenever you think about resilience or sustainability or smart cities, you're thinking about science fiction, about all those movies. But that's not true. That's not what we want to do. What we want to have is a livable city. And maybe something like this. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the poster. I get to keep the poster in my office, right? I don't have to share that?
Up to you.
Uh-huh.
I have copies.
Okay. Next, we'll have Tyler Anthony with ComEd. You can advance with the arrows or the buttons if you choose.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Tyler Anthony with Commonwealth Edison. Thanks for joining us today for today's conversation and debate on resilient infrastructure. As I was listening to Sybil talk, and he started saying, planning, planning, planning. I was ready to go right on, because it really is all about planning. But for what I'm going to do today is give you guys a perspective of resilient infrastructure with Commonwealth Edison and your electric grid, and integrate that and what the key components are that Commonwealth Edison has embarked on to create resilient infrastructure in the places and communities where you all live. Give you a little background. 20 years ago, the essence of the job at ComEd was about managing assets and restoring services in the event of outages. But today's world requires something much different. Managing the status quo will just not do. We see sweeping changes in our economy, in the ways we conduct commerce, in our day-to-day lives. A sea change in how we communicate and relate to one another. Most, if not all, of these changes involves the use of electricity. In our daily lives, online transactions have turned the traditional retail model on its head. 50% of our banking transactions are electronic. We're in the middle of a 5-year period in which internet traffic is expected to quadruple. We tweet 1 billion times per week. In commerce, we see the proliferation of new growth industries such as data centers, whose entire business model depends on high-quality power 24/7. Even in the traditional sector of manufacturing, today's industrial processes are run by microprocessors and are highly sensitive to electric grid disturbances. We also are in a country that stands for a greener future. Kind of platforming off Sybil's discussion, we envision a future where electric vehicles have a place on our roads and renewables such as solar and wind have a place in our energy production. But solar, wind, and electric vehicles require a smarter grid than the one we have today. And our expectations as consumers have changed over the last 100 years. We expect more choice, more information, and more control. Unfortunately, our electric system serves as a one-size-fits-all product. Electricity is the only thing you buy where you don't know how much you used, at what price, and until you receive a bill at the end of the month, it's too late to do anything about it. As I get into my slides, I titled this the 21st Century Grid for a 21st Century Economy. And the ComEd perspective of how to meet the new demands of the 21st century really comes in what I'll call 4 key areas. I decided to give everyone just a brief overview of the ComEd system as a background, and then primarily just touch on what Commonwealth Edison's future is in the areas of regulation, existing infrastructure improvements, grid modernization, and our emergency preparedness. First slide, just to hit a few points. We do cover 3.8 million customers in over 400 communities. We have over 5,000 miles of transmission lines, and we have over 55,000 miles of underground cable. The system peak in our service territory has been 23,753 megawatts, and we set that back in July of 2011. Northern Illinois, ComEd is separated into 4 operating regions. You can see them listed on the slide, whether it's our West region, North, Chicago, or Southern region. That's the way we divide up Northern Illinois to support our customer base. As far as the relationship we have with the distribution end of the business, our voltage classes come out of generating stations, many of the nuclear plants and coal plants in our areas at the 765 and 345 kV voltage classes, and you can see how that breaks down to the distribution voltage classes and ultimately down to the 120, 240 volt that feeds many of your homes today. As I showed in slide 26, I'm very reinforced in the fact that we're in changing times here in the state of Illinois. And in 2011, the Illinois General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favor of grid modernization to improve reliability and hold utilities to a first-of-a-kind performance standards. We just recognized the need for utilities to reasonably recover cost in order to invest and plan for the future. And basically, as far as ComEd in this new legislation, we've made a commitment of a $2.6 billion infrastructure grid improvement over the next 10 years. We have a vision of what this modernization plan will do. You can see the statement here on the slide: cost-effective technology advancements, empowerment to the customers, and more reliable and secure system. We've been through the first year of the infrastructure improvements. Half of that $2.6 billion, $1.3 billion, is primarily focused in the next 5 years, and it goes after refurbishment of our existing infrastructure. I'm showing here on this slide just some of the content of what we've completed in 2012. You can see the 5-year goal, but basically in the last 12 months, we've refurbished and replaced over 450 miles of underground residential cable. We've refurbished over 4,400 manholes, and we've tested and replaced over 250 miles of mainline cable in 2012. And as far as our wood poles, we have well over 1 million wood poles on our service territory. We've replaced or reinforced the first 2,500 of a 15,000 goal over the next 5 years. And then the last item, talking about resiliency, we've earmarked $200 million for going after different engineering standards and options to make the system more resilient and pervious to different weather and emergent events. Second half of the $2.6 billion investment has everything to do with technology and making that grid smarter. As you can see here by the meter that's located on the center of the slide, the second part of the money has everything to do with enabling customers more choice. We are going to install over a 10-year period, essentially 4 million smart meters. We're going to install approximately 2,600 distribution devices that automatically reroutes power in the event of outages so customers experience little or no interruption. And as well, the smart grid technology will enable peak time rebate pricing, help customers better manage their energy use, and allow for the integration of home area networks. This is an example of one of our completed smart substations. This is one of the stations we just completed in South Chicago, Wallace Substation, that basically allows now for the automation and integration of proactive maintenance recording, where in the past you had an individual with a clipboard and a set of readings to go take in a particular substation. And our vision here is to go similar to what we've done in Wallace, with everything being automated, and now engineers and particular owners of the different equipment can get email updates and be very much more proactive. One asset in a substation can be worth several $millions. And if we can get on that asset sooner versus waiting for a problem to actually occur, we can have direct savings for the customer. And then lastly, as far as the infrastructure grid piece, what I'm showing here, and I won't cover it, but basically I'm very proud of where we stand here in Illinois, where ComEd is a part of the first U.S. investor-owned electric utility that our allowable return, the money we make, is directly tied to our performance. This is a list of what the recent passed legislation we're committed to, whether the first two items, when you hear the terms SAIFI and CAIDI, what that basically is the amount of customers that are interrupted, and then secondly is once the customer is interrupted, how quickly do we restore them? And basically we've committed to a 20% and 15% improvement with the investment of the $2.6 billion. Okay? And then the last area I wanted to talk about around resilient infrastructure has to deal with emergency preparedness. Most recently, I think Peter mentioned what we had, the state of emergency for the flooding. Commonwealth Edison, you have to get the infrastructure right, you have to get the new technology laid in there, and then candidly, when you do have an event, you have to do very well with the expectations of our customers in restoration activities. We have a focus in emergency preparedness in 4 areas. Customer communications, we have to communicate better. People understand being out 4 days when they see the devastation, but what they can't understand is not getting good information about making decisions about the outage that they may be experiencing. Municipal interface, need to work much better with our different local, state, and government officials around prioritization. And then basically storm process improvements. Can I get that outage on quicker? Can I get the crew there quicker? And what technologies can I use to enable that? And then lastly, you saw that $200 million earmarked for system hardening. Where are those pocket areas on those neighborhoods that just continue to have repeated problems during weather events? And what can we do to eliminate or mitigate those outages? Okay? And just a few quick slides of some of the things we've implemented. You'll see here on slide 33 around communication. You can text us, you have an outage. You can report on Facebook, you'll have an outage. You will get a response from us. And if you go to our website, you'll see a new tool where it's a visual geographic tool that you can get status information like restoration, cause of outages directly on the internet, looking at your particular residence or area that you live. This is an example of a smart board. This goes back to the efficiency of getting the crew to the outages quicker. We have overlaid on Google Earth our truck positions, our outage positions, and where we are for restoration that helps in the use of selection of outages per crews as they're doing restoration efforts. Municipal interface, we have on June 13th of this year, we have a statewide drill that we're working in conjunction with several organizations, whether it's the City of Chicago, FEMA, National Guard, and even people like Citgo and Nicor, we're all doing an integrated drill here in June. And as well, we've created a new system of what we refer to as joint operating centers. Basically, joint operating centers that will open on certain customer count outages, and how we help prioritize with local municipalities, seat at the table when it comes to restoration efforts. And then the last few slides here, I won't get into these in too much detail, but I just wanted to point out that whether it's watching a downed wire, whether it's getting the people out to the jobs quicker, whether it's material or our ability to bring in mutual assistance supports from other states and areas, we're trying to focus on improvements in all of those areas based on the weather patterns that we've all experienced. And then lastly, around system hardening, I had mentioned about preventing the outage in the first place. In the engineers' toolbox, they have different applications, whether it's resilient cable-covered overhead cable, whether it's automatic fuse devices, additional tree trimming, or actually taking services that were overhead and putting them underground, are different options that we use for system hardening. So in conclusion, I would say we could all argue that what's most important to us in our day-to-day lives, you could say air, you could say water, and I don't know that you would agree that electricity is third, but I would tell you it's definitely moving up the list. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. Stefan Konya, now I do have my notes in front of me. The Building Resilience Against Climate Effects in Illinois project, right? A joint effort with UIC.
That's correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can use the little
Clicker here.
You can use the arrows or the buttons.
Thank you, Peter. Again, let's have a hand for our first two speakers. Fantastic presentations. Of course, I have to go and follow those two. But another great job also for the Metropolitan Planning Council, having a lineup that includes both academia and the private sector, and then now government. So again, making sure that they have broad representation of perspectives. So, earlier somebody mentioned to me when I first got here that, well, you're going to be going last, and I think that that's a good thing because you're probably the one aspect bringing health to the conversation about resiliency. That's probably the hardest and the biggest stretch for this group to be able to see the connection. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll at least kind of stretch some of your minds to be a little bit more open about the idea. So today I'm going to talk about the BRACE project specifically. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on public health, what we are, because I feel like not enough people really truly understand how broad the area of public health is. And then I'm going to get into the specifics of this project that we're working very closely with the University of Illinois Chicago and their School of Public Health. And then I'll give you a little food for thought at the end. So this is the official American Public Health Association map of what public health is, basically. You could probably identify with many of those circles around the community map there. I wanted to point out, too, I don't know if this has a pointer, but in the upper left-hand corner, protecting people from disasters and disease outbreaks. We have an entire Office of Preparedness and Response that works closely with IEMA. We have a seat at the State Emergency Operations Center. We work very closely with utilities as well. And then in the bottom right, you see the nice tree icon for keeping our air, water, and neighborhoods clean. So I think those are two key areas where we have a very relevant connection to this topic today. Additionally, when we talk about preparedness and response, a lot of people don't realize that public health is uniquely involved when it comes to disease outbreaks. So when you think of contagion, things like that, foodborne outbreaks, vector-borne outbreaks, West Nile, human-to-human transfer of certain infectious diseases, and also, of course, animal-to-human as well. So bird flu, swine flu, et cetera. And then natural disasters is another key element of preparedness and response. That's floods, tornadoes, droughts, hurricanes, et cetera. And then man-made and biological threats would be the third kind of key area. Anthrax, ricin, terrorism attacks, infrastructure failures as well. So it's important to kind of differentiate between the weather and climate aspect and also how they connect to health. When you think of weather, we're looking at exposure to extreme environmental conditions, such as heat, floods, and ozone. Provides environments for spread of disease, depending on the weather, mosquitoes and ticks. And then, of course, also for chronic illnesses, asthma and allergies and the rise in prevalence of those two areas. Just as a quick poll, how many people here have seasonal allergies, pollen, dust, and things like that? Okay, almost half the room. I'd beg to wager that about 20 years ago, probably wouldn't less than half of that amount. So the rates of asthma and allergies has significantly been rising over the past few decades. And then when we look at climate change, these are the factors that might increase the severity and alter those disease patterns over a long span of time. And we see that there is a relationship between weather patterns over time and those impacts on the adverse health outcomes. So here are some of those key areas where we're starting to pay attention and notice some of those connections. Heat-related illnesses, vector-borne illnesses, which is mosquitoes and others like that, so West Nile virus, et cetera. Extreme weather events, the frequency and in new areas that you're seeing more and more hurricanes, or as we were talking earlier, what they call 100-year storms, things like that. Asthma, ozone, and allergens already talked about, waterborne illnesses, injuries, carbon monoxide, mental health, and an inability of medical systems to function properly in general. This is a map here of 2011, and I'm not sure why LaSalle County is blanked out there. Maybe we just didn't have good data on that one. But essentially, it's just showing heat-related deaths in Illinois. And you can see it is spread across the state. The green dots are where the deaths occurred. And of course, in the urban environment, they're significantly higher with the urban island effect. But we also know that it's not just the deaths that the rise in heat has. It also it affects the food supply. I think last year our crop, we had a loss of over about 40% of the crop in Illinois last year. And that impacted both food supply as well as food costs. And then, of course, we know the economic impacts of that as well. So now let's talk about the main difference, and this is where I hope to dissuade you. We're not talking about who's to blame for climate change, right? The fact is it is changing. We can map out patterns are there. We're not saying, okay, this is related to humans' impact on the environment. We're not saying that this is related to just the fact that it's a natural evolution of climate. What we're more concerned with is not the mitigation of climate change. We're looking at the adaptation of it and really dealing with the fact that it is changing. So how do we prepare ourselves to be more resilient to deal with that? This is a photo of a bridge that goes across Lake Pontchartrain. And after Katrina, you can see what happened to it on the left there. And since they've rebuilt it, you can see on the right that they've decided to build significantly higher to deal with storm surges. In the past, they thought that the one on the left was more than sufficient to deal with storm surges. And as you can see, that was not the case. So we are learning and incorporating resilience into a number of areas. The BRACE project specifically is going to deal with public health plan for resilience in climate change. This is a CDC title, so don't blame us for the long name, but Building Resilience Against Climate Effects. And this is a CDC-funded project that the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health, in partnership with the Illinois Department of Public Health, applied for funding. It's a 4-year project, bring together a diverse group of stakeholders, including MPC and others, to sit down and talk about how do we plan for this and incorporate it into public health and health-related areas. So you see here the purpose is to improve the resilience of public health systems and stress brought on by increases in the burden of climate-sensitive diseases and injury. How are we going to do that? We're going to develop a climate and health adaptation plan, a set of deliberate and specific efforts to anticipate and prepare for the adverse health effects of climate change. And then the specific goal of ours is to have that plan that minimizes the adverse impacts of climate change on the health of the public in Illinois. This is the 6 main areas that we're going to be focusing on within that BRACE project. We have different work groups that are staggered to start over that 4-year period. They're going to be looking at forecasting climate impacts, assessing vulnerabilities, projecting disease burden, looking at the public health interventions that possibly can help alleviate some of that, develop and implement a climate and health adaptation plan, a formal document that hopefully just won't sit on a shelf but will be put to use, and then assess those impacts and improve the quality of that plan over and over. And throughout the entire 4-year period, there'll be a significant education and outreach effort to all the different stakeholders involved to make sure that they understand that climate change does have an impact on health in your community. So in the framework here, we want to talk about medicine versus public health. Again, and a lot of people kind of confuse the two. So, medical care is directly dealing with taking care of those individuals who have the illness, so that's after the fact. Public health is really that population-based approach, looking at prevention models, looking at what can we do as a system and long-term overall to reduce the mortality and morbidity rate within the states, and basically, how can we prevent that illness and injury for the entire population, not just subgroups of the population. In that primary prevention, we're looking at reduced exposure to extreme heat, and we're going to be looking at that within urban design, power grids, tree canopy, green roofs, and many other areas. Secondary prevention would be, if the heat index is elevated, now let's reduce the impacts on health. So that the heat alert system, how can we improve that? Checking up on a neighbor system, cooling centers. Many urban environments deal with this, and they have a number of ways of and challenges of dealing with it. One example is I know in the city of New York, they have a significant problem where the bulk of their buildings are so old that they don't have centralized air in many of them. And with the units, they typically fail with the window units for air conditioning. So they have an exacerbated problem when it comes to extreme heat within their city that cities like San Francisco and Chicago sometimes don't quite see the same numbers in. Tertiary prevention, emergency responders being trained and ready, hospital preparedness. There was an article recently that I read where one of the larger hospital systems that are building new hospitals put into their plan that they're actually focused now on and they're putting in there one of the most significant business risks is climate change, and they're looking at how can they build stronger buildings and infrastructure that can withstand the increased changes in the climate and these superstorms, these 100-year storms, et cetera. Just within the last few years, I don't know how many people are familiar with the Harrisburg tornadoes. Now, we've had tornadoes all the time, but that's just another area where we had very severe, that entire summer, very severe outbreaks in tornadoes over the Midwest. And in Harrisburg, southern Illinois, it damaged the hospital there, the only hospital within 50, 60 miles. And we had to shut down the hospital and then wait till it can be fixed before we could reopen it. So the patients that were at the hospital had to be transported to another safe facility, which, again, in a rural area was very difficult. Here's some maps that we're working on starting to get populated. And I do want to recognize both Sam Durovich and Elena Grossman, who are the ones doing all the research on this with UIC School of Public Health. So if you have any specific questions, they definitely can answer them. But we're looking at forecasting the climate impact, over a 10-year average. And if you look on the left, you see the monthly precipitation, air temperature in the center, and then soil temperature, and trying to see how those kind of correlate eventually with adverse health outcomes. Then you see here the project right now, currently we're in the middle of the vulnerability assessment, connecting demographic data, looking at those vulnerable populations based on age, race, income. Health facilities data, are gathering all the information on our hospitals, our community health centers, and others. And then we're working on the training and education component as well. Like I said, that will be going on throughout the entire 4-year period. So this is the call to action, which is always good to end a series of presentations. And again, when we're talking about how does this tie to health, these two quotes are taken from a recent Forbes article from last month. And the first quote is from The Lancet, which is Britain's premier health journal. And it says, the biggest global health threat of the 21st century is climate change. And the second quote there is from Margaret Chan. She's the Director General of the World Health Organization. And she says that climate change will affect in profoundly adverse ways some of the most fundamental determinants of health: food, air, and water. And I would even argue infrastructure. So one last thing, I could have easily have just played this TED Talk and probably done a better job, although it wouldn't have touched on the BRACE project. But has anybody here seen this besides Sam and Elena? Okay, one or two others. Great. I mean that I shared something of use to everyone. It's an 11-minute TED Talk. Google TED Talk Vicky Arroyo. It'll be very easy to find. They actually have it on YouTube as well. But it summarizes a lot of the connections, not only with health, but infrastructure and resilience and everything else. Fantastic TED Talk. She's a bit of an expert on it, I think on the East Coast. So I encourage you to look that up and watch it. It's 11 minutes well spent. So if you have any other questions, we'll be in the Q&A, but thank you very much for your time today.
So yes, that was intentional that we had government, academia, and the private sector all here at once. So in case one arm failed, we had some backups. Thank you. That was really cheesy, but, all right. So now it is time for your turn. Parfait is going to be walking around with a handheld microphone. Again, I ask you to wait until the microphone gets to you. Tell us who you are, state your name and affiliation, and then your question. And raise your hands, Parfait will find you. While he's doing that, I've got a quick question. I was doing, as I'm sure you guys were, a lot of background reading about resiliency. Atlantic Cities has had a bunch of great articles on the topic recently. Richard Florida was just interviewing a couple of experts in the field, one of whom, Jonathan Rose, made an assertion, and I want to throw this assertion at you guys and just get your reaction. His assertion was that all these systems, health systems, infrastructure, electricity, need to have a default mode, something that they default to in the case of some catastrophe, that is linear, passive, and functional. So that something breaks, this sort of falls into its default mode and it still works. Can you maybe respond or react to that from any of your three perspectives? Or not. Electricity, for example, strikes me as a challenging one to have a default mode in that regard. So.
The first thing that came to mind is bicycles and little motors. That was the first that came to mind. I think it's a great question of where do you go? I mean.
I'm sorry, are those microphones on?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Is that okay?
Yeah, better.
You know, it's a very good question. It's difficult to answer, but you would say that you appreciate electricity the most when you don't have it. And then to say what would be the default mode when you don't have it, that's you know, pretty difficult because we become more and more dependent on it. So I don't know for electricity, is there a default mode other than, you know, the old candles and flashlights and those type of things?
Bibble, any thoughts?
Well, I think the idea is really nice and it's really good. Possible. Do all these systems have a linear default mode? I mean, that's as simple as that. I mean, if so there's no electricity and everybody gathers in one central plaza or something per neighborhood, then you know might run into health problems. So what's the default mode for that? I mean, I don't know. I think it's sounds good. I want to know more.
All right.
Very good question.
Thumper. Questions from the audience? I also wanted to point out, too, we were happy that Rockefeller Foundation coordinated the announcement of their $100 million effort with our roundtable today. They were going to make the announcement here, but the flights didn't work out. So, yes, Rockefeller yesterday, this question over here on the aisle, announced a $100 million grant program to cities, approximately 100 cities around the U.S., for a three-pronged approach towards resiliency. One, to create a resiliency plan. Two, to figure out how to engage better the private sector and their equity in solving some of these challenges. And then three, the sort of intriguing carrot is to actually fund a chief resiliency officer for that particular city. So that was just announced yesterday, and I think Stefan's looking for yet another chief title, so maybe he'll be going for that. Yes, question.
Erin Inman with Primera Engineers. My question's for Tyler. Can you talk about how the Oak Park Smart Grid pilot is going and what ComEd has learned from that so far?
Well, for the Oak Grid is about little over 240,000 smart meters that we put in the Oak Park general area as a test case. And I think the best way to summarize it is going very well. We're trying to get different measures on client usage of different aspects of what the smart grid can enable. And I would tell you the best lesson learned, I think, is we had quite a bit of different entities involved, not just Commonwealth Edison, but whether it was state, local, interest groups, as far as trying to come up with the best practices for enabling the build-out that we're looking to embark on. But I would tell you that it's been very successful for us. We've gotten a lot of lessons learned on both installation as well as customer usage. And I would tell you that we have some definitive examples of where people have saved quite a bit of money on their electric usage once you just give them more information.
Question here in the middle. Where's Parfait? Oh, or grab the one on the end as you're passing by. It's easier.
Hello, Dr. Amel Tokars, Kendall County Health Department. Just a reflection on, I think, the topic and what the three of you are saying. One of the things that we reflect on quite a bit in public health is the diversity of this matter of climate change from natural disaster, in particular the complex ones where we see the juxtaposition of natural disaster with man-made material, as in what we saw in Japan with the nuclear energy matter a while ago, but also, as Stefan was bringing up, the issues of daily living and climate change and health and well-being. And I would add to what Stefan was talking about, not just those physical health issues that we worry about, but socioeconomic well-being and the loss of to the end user, what that means, what a loss of water means. We don't always think about that in the United States. But what does the loss of water mean? What does an influx of powerful water mean to the end user in terms of socioeconomic well-being? So these are very, very critical issues. So I just appreciate being here and hearing some of the thoughts on it.
Thank you. Any reactions to the comment?
I mean, I can certainly echo what she said. I could have gone on probably for another 20, 30 minutes or even longer, especially if you know me, I can go on for longer. No, absolutely agree. And to further expand upon that, it's how can when you talk about the end user and when there's some kind of a large-scale event or something that happens, a natural disaster, extreme heat, whatever it may be, how does that affect how society interacts with each other as well, and ultimately leads to adverse health outcomes sometimes when it comes to reduction in transportation options and things like that. So I definitely agree with you. When I talked earlier about the drought, it's something that last year, we saw as a big problem, not only for the food supply and the crops, and Department of Agriculture was very concerned about it, and we did see the prices skyrocket. But it did also adversely impact the water supply, and I don't think that got enough press. But there was a lot of rural areas across the state that had significantly low levels, scary low levels in their water supply for their municipalities. And we were at the point of trying to figure out how are we going to ensure that they had safe potable water, drinkable water, et cetera. And we didn't really have a lot of plans for how we're going to be able to help do that. And so it's certainly an area of concern, but it does deal with a lot more than what I just initially covered.
Okay, so I know we have another hand in the middle. Yes.
Jim Cox with the City of Chicago, Department of Housing and Economic Development. And my question was for Mr. Anthony. It seems that one of the biggest parts of storm hardening for weather-related events would be burying overhead lines. And I saw that you had 5,200 miles are going to be buried. And I know that that's very expensive, but I was wondering if you have a long-term plan for burying most of the system and how you determine or prioritize where the burials will occur.
So a couple parts to your question. So one, I think it was, well, how do you decide? Our statute with the Commerce Commission, currently, I mean, it's been around for a very long time, is the least cost option. That's what we're regulated to. However, you do have situations where you look at a risk scoring model that says, in this particular area, you have constant problems, whether it's trees or whatever the situation is, and at times that cost option could be to underground. Okay, so we've been looking at it much harder and in different ways to ask ourselves, when does it make sense to underground? And that is the preferred option when it becomes cost effective based on the situation and where you're doing it at. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, to underground our system, there was some initial costs put to that, and it was just unbearable to the consumer to do something like undergrounding the whole system. So to your point on future installs, we look at our design standards of where we can underground at a price that makes sense for us based on the situations. And candidly, with all of these weather pattern changes in these storms, it makes you ask the question, what is the least cost option? Makes you kind of re-look at your thought processes around that. So to your point is, where it makes sense, we are going with the underground option. We're looking at it in very different ways because it is a preferred option when it makes engineering sense based on the situation.
Thanks for that. There's another issue I wanted to just throw out too that I was learning about in my readings. This concept of improvised responses. There's within a number of the systems that we've talked about today, there's a sort of an inherent tendency to look towards government to react to, or the private sector to react to some change, some monumental change. Yet there's also seems to be a lot of, the rest of us who are just sort of like, oh, when's our power going to come back on? And we're sort of wait. There's a lot of power within the community to do something in response to that, to these events, to these causes. So this concept of improvised responses is another one that I've been reading about. How do you empower or create a system such that if there is a failure of some sort, the people have a way to react or respond to that change? And I don't know, maybe even in the health side, there's an analogy to that?
Sure, and it's funny when you first talk about it, I hesitate to bring up the show Doomsday Preppers, but they talk. If anybody's seen that, it's a great example right now.
History Channel, right?
So it's something that goes on frequently in government, and I would argue even in the private sector, I'm sure, that emergency preparedness response does exactly that. The BRACE project is a part of that. Having that plan in place should something happen. Our Office of Community Outreach, our Office of Health Promotion, and other programs try to do a significant amount of awareness campaigns about preparedness activities and what can you do to be prepared. IEMA is a great partner in that. They've kicked off a number of initiatives in the last 2 years, even around pet safety and having a disaster plan for your pets and things like that. I think the federal government even has one as well. I think the title of that is called PETS. Yeah, I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's PETS. So, there certainly is a lot of education and toolkits that can be rolled out. We actually are at the Department of Public Health for the state are lucky that we have 96 or 97 some odd local health departments across the state. We have a representative, one of them at least here today, in Dr. Tokars. So all public health happens locally when it comes to that response element, and we try to provide as many tools and resources. We do have an SNS response, a strategic national stockpile for having tablets and other things that can be available to help respond to things. But a lot of it is going to happen from the community's resources, the individuals living in that community, hopefully with some guidance and planning from their local government.
Yeah, I had that slide up there about the joint operating centers, and I didn't have a lot of time to dive into that, but that was a very aggressive effort to work with our 400 municipalities and our county agencies to what I'll call dimensionalize storm restoration. Historic storm restoration, the way you prioritize it is the next outage with the most customer impact is next in line to be restored when crews free up. So been very, very parochial on highest customer count, they get the resources, and we work down the line. Well, what we've done with this JOC and working with these municipalities, we've basically dimensionalized going to all 400 municipalities and said, what is the most important thing to your constituents, our customers, from the perspective of operating that municipality in town? And we basically have preloaded well over 3,000 locations across the 400 municipalities that we will dimensionalize the priorities along with next highest customer count back. You get a red light in a small town could be critical to getting them moving next versus something to the like. Now, we've always prioritized hospitals, emergency facilities, but this has taken that to the next level to work hand in hand with the municipalities about what's most important to them after they receive a large number of outages.
Back in the corner, I see Kevin's hand up. I don't know if John Tova has anything to say. We're also joined by the Chief Technology Officer way in the back there. Wave your hand, John, so we see, who's been doing a lot of stuff on the citizen response side too. So that's just a prep, John. I don't know, maybe you have something to say later. Maybe, I don't know. Kevin?
Kevin Brubaker with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. I'm curious at sort of the softest extreme of this resilience, about community building. I think about major storms a couple of years ago when my wife was making soup for all the neighbors without heat, about power outages where you see extension cords run across the street to power people's refrigerators. That only happens when people know and trust each other. What are you thinking about that?
You know, I can't speak for our department on activities specifically because we have some things in the hopper that aren't quite ready yet. But I have seen some examples of it, and it's funny that we have Mr. Tolva here because I know he's been working with, I believe, the what's the name of the I'm trying to think of the name of the organization. Something in America. Code for America, thank you. I don't know why this surprised you. But it's a great program that I believe we're in the second year of, or when I say we, the city of Chicago was in the second year of applying for. But there was another Code for America program, I think in Boston, and they talk about that citizen empowerment, so to speak, or citizen engagement. And they developed a model for removing debris and things that block and shoveling out fire hydrants. So there's an adopt a fire hydrant on a block, and they created an online app for that and a tool, so citizens can, basically adopt a fire hydrant, clear its way, and make sure that if there's a fire in the winter or things like that, somebody could readily respond to it, and they wouldn't have to worry about finding the fire hydrant, so to speak. So that's just one small example. I know they're doing amazing things with Code for America in Chicago around 311 and its use and integrating that with social media and a number of other things. So I'm sure he could talk more about that. But that's just one small example I thought of with citizen empowerment or citizen engagement.
Good, thank you. Oh, hey, Mr. Tolva has a question.
Just a comment.
Commercial there, so.
Well, no, it's just a comment on that. I think what the ADOPT program, Adopt a Sidewalk and Tsunami Siren in Honolulu and Storm Drain in Seattle shows is that resiliency can also be lots and lots of very small feedback loops, right? So in that case, down to the citizen level. One thing that I was thinking of when you were talking about the Joint Operations Center is the NATO event that we had here, and that was like, sort of a planned disaster that didn't happen, but we were all ready for it, right? And we were in the Emergency Operations Center watching all these cameras and watching the protesters move around and trailing them with, empty buses with air conditioning in them and things like that. But what we actually ended up using was the live public feeds that the protesters were sending from their phones that were way more useful because they had audio, they were at street level, and they were moving with the crowds than the mounted cameras. And in my mind, that is a more resilient response system. We could hear them. We could hear that they were calling Michigan Avenue Michigan Road, so we knew they weren't from here. So we knew they needed help. Those sorts of things. You're making the feedback loop smaller down to the street level. One thing I'll just add is those kind of those metro maps are really cool, and you can do those kinds of things for the interdependencies of systems, and we do that. And you can model those. And so you might have seen that the Bloomberg Philanthropies issued a mayor's challenge recently. You submit your best idea, and 5 of them got selected. Chicago's was one of them. We just were awarded $1 million to build a predictive analytics platform to run simulations. So that's not something we've really talked about here, but modeling disasters or modeling events that require resiliency, and then sort of looking at where the interventions are needed is also how we do planning.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you in the audience, too, John.
I just want to say that it's completely true. I mean, we're really now changing the way we do things, especially now in academia. I know using smartphones, for instance, in real time, knowing where people are, what they tweet, and soon on your smartphone, you're actually going to have an environmental detector. It's going to be able to tell you what's the air quality, and we're going to be able to measure everything in real time. So I think these little feedback loops are really coming. They're coming a lot faster than we think. And I want to say almost wait a little bit because, if we come up with a solution now, in 2 years, we're going to have to come up with a completely new solution.
Hold that thought. Question here?
Hi, my name is Raymond Chan. I'm from Northwestern University's Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, graduate student. My question goes back to the idea of trying to build resilient systems. How does then a manager, an operator, or a planner then measure how resilient their system is? We talk about planning, but then how do we know our plan is good? How do we know if it's going to work?
Oh, I think that's for me. And we have no.
I mean, guys that come at.
We have no idea. We have no idea. I'm really struggling at the moment to come up with new metrics, what I call metrics, to see are we good or are we not good? And we're always missing something. And really, that's why I was so hard on network optimization before, because we're always going to have one constraint, but we're always going to miss one thing. And I think that's a great question. I don't know if we can come up with one metric, but I'm working really, really hard on that.
I'd also just like to say that, when you talk about measuring, that's a challenge for public health consistently because it's all a prevention-based model, right? Essentially. So if we're doing our job, it's hard to measure that because nobody's seeing an adverse impact. So, normal life is going on. People are healthy. I mean, there are some metrics out there, mortality rate, morbidity rate, there's birth data, there's other things. But for the average constituent or the average user that's out there, if we're doing our job, nobody really knows it. They only hear about it when something bad happens. And I think that's kind of the same thing for the built environment. They look at building codes. In government, it takes a long time to update those codes. We just recently are proposing updating our plumbing code right now. And our department oversees the licensing and permitting for plumbing in the state. And it's been, decade or so before we've updated those. But now we're just starting to look at how can we better use stormwater runoff and things like that to help reduce some of its impact on the water table and other things. So, but updating those building codes specifically also, same thing. At that time, they look and say, okay, in San Francisco, earthquake-resistant buildings should have X, Y, Z in it. And then they realize when a bigger earthquake comes along, oh, that wasn't sufficient, or we never imagined that this size of a hurricane could hit New York. We didn't plan for that. It wasn't worked into our code, which is 10, 20, 30 years out of date. So it is a challenge because those metrics move. And with climate change, the severity of these storms are getting more frequent and beyond measures that we ever thought they could achieve. So it's difficult to continually plan for that. You kind of say, okay, we'll be 10 times above what we think now. Well, then what happens when you get to there? Then you're, where do you go from there?
Yeah. Speaking for ComEd, Sybil, Stephen, I measured and measured and measured and measured again when it comes to our performance metrics. We judge a lot of our performance on historical rates of the number of outages, for example, our service territory occurs, how quick we respond, how many minutes a customer is out. Then we look at our worst performing circuits, our 1% circuits. Then we do a series of municipality meetings. Like we did over 100 municipality meetings after the 2011 big storms we had with over 900,000 customers out. And in those 100 municipal meetings, we even took down specific feedback about, I live on Elm Street, Elm Street's always out, you guys are missing me, and then do an analysis on Elm Street. So whether it's the formal measures or informal measures, we pay great attention to them. And then in the industry of electric power, there's also benchmark groups. Like we get compared to other cities similar size. We're in a group of 28 similar size utilities that we compare ourselves every year to find out who's best practices. We rate ourselves in different quartiles based on the key areas, whether it's financial cost or whether it's performance. But from a metrics point of view, we get quite a bit of that. Now the next step for us is, I talked about all the integration of the smart grid technology, and now you're going to have vast amounts of information, whether it's from the meters, and I think the utility that integrates that information to have better measures will also be next steps for us.
Struck by the Einstein quote here, Sybil. Did that resonate as we were talking here? To measure whether we're resilient enough, we build a higher bridge, we build a taller wall, and then 10 years later, same problem. So the same solution leads to the same problems. There are cities across the world that are developing today. Another story I recently learned, India in 1990, right? You had to wait about 10 years to get a landline. And so people put their name in to get their landline, and then before they knew it, the cellular network was developed, and they didn't need the landline anymore. Now everybody's got cell phones. So that's perhaps one twist on taking a new tack to solve an old problem. Do you have advice for new cities, how we can avert making some of the mistakes of the past, building systems that aren't predicated on past practices to be more resilient?
Well, some of the best examples we have now, I think one of the best is probably Rio, where they have a joint operating control room and they see everything that's going on real time, and so you can react right away. I think, we're in the era of big data, so we have a lot of data coming in. We have very often no idea how to use that data, and because it's completely overwhelming. But it's about being real time, using that data. Maybe a centralized control room is the answer. Maybe it's multiple control rooms. But I think certainly it's being able to first of all, get that data, manage the data in real time, and then respond and sharing. So I'm really happy. had never heard of so it's AT&T and ComEd, and I'm really, really happy to hear that. I think that's a great step.
Thank you. Okay, I think we, another question over here?
Perfect. I'm Mary Sue Barrett. I'm president of the Metropolitan Planning Council, so I'm delighted that you all made time to join us today. I also want to share an additional resource with you today. There was a New Yorker article, January or February, called Adaptation, that was really fabulous, and it was actually shared with me by a colleague, Craig Howard from the MacArthur Foundation, who was with us until a little bit ago. He had to leave early, so credit to Craig on that. But it talks about a number of examples from around the globe, and actually highlights some Chicago examples, specifically the heat wave in 1995, where so many hundreds of mostly elderly people died. And compared two Chicago neighborhoods, one Englewood, the other Auburn Gresham, very similar demographics, economically, racially, housing type, et cetera. And the death rates in Englewood were exponentially factors higher than in Auburn Gresham, where the network of supportive organizations and block clubs, et cetera, was stronger. So I do think that the answers and the solutions, I'm glad we're covering a lot of breadth of ground today because they are complex. It is government and utilities who have to be proactive and anticipate and project and measure, but it's also all of us who have the solutions, and I think we've had some good discussions about that. I'm wondering if the panelists think that we have a bit of a Midwest mindset to overcome here, that it's not just thinking about, okay, what's the next worst thing that you can think of or can't quite think of that can happen? How do we get ready for that? Or how do our complicated structures work together? But get a little, we get a little self-confident because we're not in one of the coasts of the country. And we think that that's, an advantage that protects us a little bit. The idea of innovation, unleashing innovation, and systems and data and applications and so forth seems to be something that Chicago is starting to embrace, but both our Midwest mentality of, it might not happen here, and expecting some expert to solve our problem seems to be kind of Midwestern ideals that we may need to break out of. I'm wondering what you think of that.
Personally, I don't think that that's a problem. I think that we are very concerned, not only at government, but also I think the average citizen is very concerned that we do need to be prepared for a lot of things. If it's not floods, I mean, just recently we had over 40 counties in Illinois that were declared disaster areas due to flooding. The governor was flying from county to county across the state over several days to try to see the damage of it, and it was amazing how bad it was. And that's not the first time. We've had Mississippi River floods. We've had other flash floods within the city. The city of Chicago has to deal with flash floods from time to time. And obviously, like you referenced the 1995 heat wave, but we've also had other extreme heat summers and since then. So I think that in general, I think a lot of people know we do need to prepare that even though it's not maybe a hurricane, it was in the Hurricane Ike, I think it was. We got $170 million in HUD funding to mitigate damage from floods. That was offshoots from Hurricane Ike coming up and hitting Illinois and causing floods across Illinois. So even though we're landlocked, so to speak, we're not necessarily even saved from hurricanes. But when you talk about open data, in your last question as well, same thing. I think we are embracing that. I think that we're a couple years into it now. We're probably behind other cities in some cases, but we're rapidly diving into it. And you have an opendata.gov website that's a partnership between the city, the county, the state. Our agency collects a ton of data. We're trying to put as many data sets in there as possible so others can innovate with that data and use it. At Public Health, we do a really good job with our data around public health informatics and disease monitoring and trying to source where disease comes from and spreads. We don't do it so much on infrastructure and some of the other preparedness and operations and things like that. So we're just now starting to get more data available to us that hopefully we can use for modeling and planning. But that's been an issue in the past.
The only thing I would add, Mary Sue, is I based on ComEd, we pay attention to the weather probably more than most. And I would tell you one of the things that makes me somewhat jealous is on the East Coast, they get a notification that a hurricane's going to hit 4, 6, 8 days. And your comment about, hey, we're Midwest and it probably won't happen here is bad. Unfortunately, when the big ones do come here, we don't get little to any notification or heads up the way the weather patterns form in our. So there's actually a piece of me that says we have to be even better than some of the East Coast states because we don't get near the warning, at least my experience. I'm not saying like I know climate trends, but my experience has been little warning here. We actually have to be better at response than maybe some of our East Coast cities that may get a week or two, and they can position people, crews, resources where we might have to actually stop on a dime to be able to respond.
So I want to get back to Josh Ellis, also with the Metropolitan Planning Council. Thank you all for being here. I came here today from a meeting at the South Suburban Mayors and Managers Association. So a cluster of independent municipalities with relatively independent water systems, relatively independent transportation systems, relatively independent school systems, so on and so forth, who are all working together on common solutions. And I asked them about this Rockefeller opportunity for a chief resiliency officer. And I asked one town, and he said, how resilient can we be as a small town? And the conversation started of whether that cluster of communities should apply for a chief resiliency officer for that interjurisdictional collaboration. So let's assume the city of Chicago with John Tolva's leadership and everybody else is going to be fine. Those clusters of communities in the south suburbs, if it's day one and I'm the Rockefeller-sponsored chief resiliency officer, what's your advice for me on day one of my new job in that position to get those communities working together in preparing for whatever range of events we're talking about?
Go ahead, Sybil.
I'm an engineer, I don't deal with people.
One of the things I didn't get to go over too much in detail on the BRACE project is the fact that even though it's a public health study and a public health preparedness plan, or adaptation plan, I should say, is the fact that we still made sure that we included all the different stakeholders that are involved. So, IEPA, Environmental Protection, Department of Transportation, all the other state agencies, IEMA, that have a role in it, as well as planning organizations like MPC, CMAP, and others, and other key stakeholders. So I would recommend, just like any plan when you're starting to work on it, is identify who all the relevant players are, even if it's not, their number one issue. It may be lower on the priority list for them, but it's something that they still need to be included on, and get their take and basically get them to buy into it ultimately, because they're going to have to feed into one aspect of it eventually.
I was just going to say, I think, Josh, it's excellent that they're getting together and even having the conversation about how do we integrate, because I don't know that you would have had that 5 or 10 years ago. So I guess, and then what that typically leads to, integrated solutions typically lead to better solutions and less cost. My advice for them coming out of the gate would be strengthen numbers. However, there's other places in the world that we can learn from, and I think at times we can become a little narrow in the Midwest. So my piece of advice for them would be try to get out and see what others are doing and see if there's already integrated solutions that they might be able to bring to bear.
I apologize, we're going to have to cut it off. Before you leave, though, if I could ask. Survey. We definitely use the results of those for planning future events. There's a basket on the table where you checked in. You can leave it there. If you want to just take your lunch and pack that, put it under your seat so nobody trips over it on the way out, we'll come around and clean those up. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank ComEd for sponsoring, and I particularly want to thank our speakers today for their thoughtful words. So thank you all. We're adjourned. Yes, the battery.
No. Those integrated solutions, because see, sometimes we'll think here's who we are, here's water.
What's up? How long are you in town for? Friday morning. talk to either of those guys?